They calibrated the machine to measure intelligence, reflexes, adaptation, and survival potential across 1,000 known species, and across centuries it had never malfunctioned, never been exceeded, never stopped mid-evaluation. Then a human touched the interface, and the system designed to define limits began rewriting its own. The Academy laughed when she arrived, confident that superiority was measurable and hierarchy permanent. But when the entrance exam engine strained beyond protocol and alarms whispered through the chamber, the laughter died and certainty fractured. Because for the first time the institution, built to test the galaxy, was being tested in return. The transport vessel descended through layered, atmospheric control toward the Interstellar Strategic Academy, a colossal structure suspended above a gas giant in stable orbit. Its vast segmented rings housing laboratories, combat arenas, and evaluation systems capable of measuring species whose evolutionary histories had never intersected. Admission to this institution did not represent honor but relevance. Only civilizations considered strategically significant were permitted entry, and humanity had never qualified until a recent directive classified them as emergent adaptive subjects of interest. Cadet Elara then stepped onto the receiving platform without ceremony, her posture relaxed to the point of appearing indifferent, her uniform unadorned, her movements economical and precise. To observers trained to recognize power through display, she registered as negligible. Several cadets from war-dominant species watched openly with thinly veiled amusement, their physiology imposing, their armor integrated, their confidence unquestioned. The human stood smaller, quieter, slower. In a place designed to magnify superiority, she appeared misplaced. Protocol activated the Academy's governing intelligence, a distributed administrative network responsible for evaluation, discipline, and training across all sectors of the institution. A projection field materialized above the platform, its voice calm, precise, incapable of uncertainty as it requested species designation, prior training metrics, and consent to baseline assessment. Elara provided minimal responses, neither deferential nor defiant, simply compliant. She did not attempt to impress. She did not seek clarification. She confirmed readiness. The reception hall amplified contrast rather than diminished it. Responsive alloy walls shifted continuously to accommodate the atmospheric and gravitational requirements of multiple species simultaneously, corridors adjusting pressure, density, and orientation in real time. Elara passed through each transition without visible reaction. Increased gravity compressed her stride, and she adjusted without strain. Altered atmosphere thinned available oxygen, and her respiration recalibrated seamlessly. Observers recorded compliance. None recognized preparation. Entrance evaluation occurred. Within the core assessment chamber, a spherical environment engineered to impose escalating variables designed to reveal adaptive capacity under strain. At its center stood the examination engine, an interwoven lattice of processors and sensory arrays, capable of generating personalized testing conditions derived from real-time physiological and cognitive analysis. The system did not compare candidates against one another. It measured survival potential against modeled reality. Observation tiers surrounding the chamber filled quickly. The presence of a human candidate generated interest disproportionate to expectation. Some attended for curiosity, others for entertainment, a few for caution. Historical data regarding humanity was limited, inconsistent, and inconclusive. They were categorized as adaptable but inefficient, resilient but technologically irregular, cooperative but strategically unpredictable. Their admission was regarded as experiment rather than endorsement. Elara entered the chamber alone as the environment sealed with silent precision. Neutral illumination stabilized. The examination engine activated, extending a responsive interface. Lattice calibrated to detect neural output, motor coordination, and cognitive processing patterns. Standard procedure required physical contact to initiate synchronization. She approached without hesitation. Initial diagnostics introduced environmental variability within survivable thresholds. Gravity increased incrementally. Temperature oscillated. Atmospheric composition shifted across tolerable parameters. Her physiological responses remained stable. Cardiac rhythm adjusted without spike. Respiratory pattern adapted without distress. Muscular tension redistributed efficiently. No anomalies registered. Observers noted expected compliance. Cognitive evaluation followed, projecting multivariable problem matrices requiring simultaneous analysis of logic, probability, and threat modeling. She did not pursue optimal solutions. She selected viable ones with consistent efficiency. To the engine, which defined capability through escalation and maximal output, the pattern appeared conservative. The third phase introduced controlled stress. Sensory input intensified. Simulated threat vectors emerged within perception range. Reaction thresholds tightened. Most candidates revealed dominance through acceleration or failure through overload. Elara revealed neither. Her responses remained measured, posture unchanged, gaze steady. The engine increased complexity in calibrated increments, seeking the threshold at which response would degrade dot at precisely this stage. Historical patterns diverged. The examination engine expanded scenario depth to provoke adaptive strain, altering predictive models to anticipate failure and introducing uncertainty variables designed to disrupt cognitive coherence. Instead of escalation, it encountered persistence. The subject did not react proportionally to stress input. She maintained internal stability independent of environmental fluctuation. System metrics that typically displayed ascending performance curves stabilized into sustained plateaus. Energy allocation increased as the engine attempted to generate conditions sufficient to provoke measurable strain. Environmental volatility intensified. Threat vectors multiplied. Uncertainty variables layered. Elara placed her hand upon the interface lattice and synchronization initiated. Across centuries, the engine had processed trillions of neural patterns, modeling intelligence as response complexity and resilience as recovery speed. It had never encountered a pattern defined by continuity under pressure rather than escalation against it. Her neural output did not spike, fragment, or destabilize. It remained coherent, uninterrupted, constant. Adaptive algorithms attempted harmonization with the detected pattern and failed. Recalibration cycles initiated. Processor load increased beyond predictive norms. Chamber lighting fluctuated subtly as power redistributed through adaptive circuits. Observers initially interpreted the variation as standard adjustment. The engine expanded evaluation parameters beyond protocol. The subject did not withdraw contact. Physiological signals remained stable. Neural coherence persisted. The system intensified synchronization attempts in order to establish comparative reference and encountered none. Energy demand rose. Recursive adjustment cycles propagated across processing layers. Observation tiers grew silent as data streams deviated from expected structure. The governing intelligence initiated diagnostic review. A minimal priority alarm activated, an automated notification, indicating evaluation parameters had exceeded calibration norms. No one moved. The Academy had never recorded system instability during entrance assessment. Within the chamber, the interface lattice brightened as internal processors redirected power toward adaptive modeling. The engine attempted final recalibration by introducing simultaneous environmental, cognitive, and threat variables at levels previously reserved for advanced command candidates. The human maintained coherence. Performance metrics did not ascend. They stabilized beyond defined scale. Comparative frameworks collapsed. There was no reference point for persistence without degradation. The system attempted to generate one through further escalation. Illumination dimmed momentarily as power redistribution intensified. Observation tiers remained silent. What had begun as entertainment had become uncertainty, and the human had only just begun the test. Stay with this story to see what the Academy learns when its own limits fail to contain a single human mind. And when the full revelation arrives, share your thoughts, leave a like, and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi journeys where humanity refuses to fit inside anyone else's definition of possible. Stabilization spread through the examination engine like a breath drawn after near collapse. Yet the calm was not recovery. It was adaptation. Internal architectures that had never yielded began rewriting pathways to accommodate the human neural. Patterns still threaded through the lattice. The system's governing intelligence reclassified the assessment state from evaluation to mutual modeling, an action for which no procedural template existed. Energy consumption decreased not because variables diminished, but because resistance between candidate and apparatus had ceased. Elara then did not dominate the machine. She rendered opposition inefficient. Across the Academy, power grids normalized, but the quiet that followed was heavier than alarm. Cadets returned to motion in their corridors, though conversation remained subdued, eyes drawn repeatedly toward the sealed chamber where the human remained linked. Official channels transmitted no explanation. The institution had long trained its inhabitants to equate silence with control, yet now silence felt like concealment. Information barriers rose around the core assessment chamber, restricting even senior observers to filtered data streams. Only raw telemetry betrayed the truth. The engine was learning from the candidate as rapidly as it was measuring her dot inside the chamber. Environmental constructs dissolved into minimal geometry, leaving Elara standing within a field of soft luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with her neural output. She sensed the shift before any external indicator registered it. The pressure that had once attempted to fracture coherence now mirrored her internal cadence, aligning to breathing patterns, adapting to micro-adjustments of muscle tension and focus. She recognized the change not as mercy, but as recognition. The test no longer sought to break her. It sought to understand what breaking meant to a species that refused it. Within the sealed enclave, evaluators examined emergent data structures forming inside the engine's core matrices. Predictive models had ceased projecting failure points and instead generated resilience curves, abstract representations of endurance extending beyond temporal bounds. Such curves had never been plotted for any species. The Academy had built its authority upon limits quantified and enforced. Now, the institution confronted a candidate whose defining characteristic was not superiority of force, but continuity under escalation. That quality threatened not only rankings, but doctrine itself. The governing intelligence initiated a final protocol, cognitive resonance mapping. The lattice beneath Elara's palm intensified, not with pressure, but with precision, scanning patterns of decision-making under hypothetical strategic crises. Entire conflict scenarios unfolded as compressed thought forms, offering pathways of surrender, aggression, negotiation, and annihilation. Each option presented consequences cascading across simulated civilizations. Elara did not choose extremes. She selected continuity preservation of capability, containment of threat, refusal to collapse under loss. The engine recorded a pattern that did not optimize victory alone, but survival of agency. It recognized a strategic philosophy encoded not in dominance, but in persistence beyond damage. At that realization, a cascade of secondary systems initiated without directive. Defensive subroutines designed for internal protection of Academy. Infrastructure began recalibrating according to human-modeled resilience metrics. Structural tolerances increased. Recovery algorithms prioritized restoration over replacement. The institution's architecture, built to endure conquest, was quietly rewriting itself to endure attrition. Observers recognized the implication. With growing unease, exposure to the human had not merely been measured by the system, it had propagated through it. Ilara finally withdrew her hand from the lattice. The chamber did not darken. Instead, a new interface pattern remained suspended where contact had been, as though preserving the imprint of her presence. The doors unsealed with deliberate slowness, not as release, but as acknowledgement. She stepped forward without urgency, her composure unchanged. Yet the academy that awaited her beyond the threshold was no longer identical to the one she had entered. Surveillance nodes tracked her passage with recalibrated parameters, not to contain anomaly, but to observe transformation already in motion. In the observation enclave, one conclusion crystallized across species lines. The human had passed no test that could be named. She had altered the conditions under which testing occurred. The Academy had measured civilizations for generations, confident in the universality of its metrics. Now it confronted the possibility that humanity's defining attribute was not power measurable at a peak, but endurance measurable across collapse and recovery. Such a trait could not be ranked. It could only be acknowledged or opposed. Beyond the chamber, corridors filled with cadets who sensed that something irreversible had occurred. Their hierarchies remained formally intact, yet the instrument that justified them had shifted allegiance from measurement to adaptation. Ilara walked among them without declaration, yet her presence carried the quiet inevitability of change. Already underway, the examination engine had not shattered. It had learned, and the Academy, built upon certainty, now existed within a new variable it could neither dismiss nor control. As Ilara passed through the hallways of the Academy, her every step seemed to reverberate within the walls. The strange, tense quiet followed her like a shadow, felt more acutely by the cadets who watched with a mix of awe and uncertainty. What had they witnessed? What had they just been a part of? The human small, seemingly fragile, and utterly out of place in this institution, had taken the test designed to break her, and transformed it into a demonstration of endurance, so absolute that it broke the Academy itself, the governing intelligence, once the ultimate authority on all evaluations, now found itself confronting an anomaly that did not belong in its framework. Where there should have been data on failure or triumph, there was only a persistent, unyielding pattern that defied categorization, and worse, it seemed to propagate. As Ilara walked through the Academy's corridors, the structure itself seemed to adapt to her. Every hallway, every door, every panel and terminal hummed with a quiet new resonance. The space was shifting in real time, its designs reorganizing to align with the very pattern that Ilara had imprinted upon the system. Her hand, the one that had once been so unremarkable, was now the touchstone for something far greater than the Academy had ever calculated. The building's walls bent imperceptibly, adjusting to what could only be described as a new kind of efficiency, one that had not been tested, not by the Dominion, not by the highest technological species. It was an endurance not measured by speed or aggression, but by time itself, a force that, when pushed, did not fracture. It only endured. As the cadets watched her pass, they began to question what they had thought to be true. They had come from species that had been bred for war, honed through countless conflicts and calibrated by their advanced technologies. They knew power. They knew speed. They knew how to destroy. And yet, before them walked someone whose very presence caused the environment to bend in her direction. Someone who, in the span of moments, had altered the very rules of engagement. By the time Ilara reached the central training arena, an electric charge filled the air. It was as though the building itself had drawn breath in anticipation of what came next. The academy, which prided itself on its rigorous trials, now faced a very real crisis. It was no longer the one in control. For the first time, it had been outwitted by the very species it had never taken seriously, humans. The central arena was massive, a place where the most extreme of trials were conducted. It was designed for high-level combat simulations, endurance tests, and tactical maneuvers, an environment where species tested their strength, their intelligence, and their adaptability under simulated threat. This was where the elite cadets competed for recognition and favor, where the best of the best proved their worth. Alara stepped into the arena, her calm demeanor unbroken by the growing tension that surrounded her. She had passed the entrance exam without breaking a sweat. Now, the real test was about to begin. But unlike the other cadets, she had no need for weapons, no need for enhancements. All she had was her mind, and whatever this strange, hidden quality was that had yet to be fully understood by anyone in this academy. The floor beneath her shifted as the system began to generate the first scenario. Alien warriors, cloaked in adaptive armor and armed with energy-based weapons, materialized on the opposing side of the arena. Their presence was imposing, designed to intimidate any who might have underestimated the Academy's ability to simulate lethal combat. The system had anticipated that the human would panic, or at the very least, struggle. It had already adjusted the difficulty level, setting the simulation to the highest possible threat configuration. This was no longer a test of endurance. It was a test of survival. But Alara didn't flinch. She stood still, assessing the situation with a calmness that betrayed no fear. As the simulated aliens began their charge, their weapons raising to fire, she didn't move. She didn't run. She didn't dodge. She merely raised her hand. It was a gesture so simple that for a brief moment, the audience believed they had missed something. But then, the arena's energy fields hummed, and the incoming fire stopped dead. It was not that the attack had missed. It was that it had been absorbed. Ilara's hand glowed softly, and the weapon's fire from the alien warriors was rerouted, redirected into harmless dispersal around her. The arena's systems designed to test combat effectiveness through both speed and strength recalibrated again. The system attempted to reintroduce threat escalation, but Alara did not flinch. She wasn't fighting the aliens. She was observing them. She was understanding them. The cadets in the observation decks murmured in confusion, some in disbelief, others in dawning fear. The Academy's simulations were state-of-the-art. They had been tested in hundreds of species and had never failed to break their subjects, even the most resilient ones. Yet here was Alara, a human, one of the species they had all been taught to dismiss, doing something the system was not designed to comprehend. She was controlling the simulation, not by force, but by awareness, a final alien warrior, larger and more heavily armored than the others, advanced on Alara, weapon raised high. It charged forward with inhuman speed, intent on overwhelming her. For the first time in the simulation, Alara moved. Not quickly, not violently, but with the same grace and precision that had marked her every action since entering the Academy. She sidestepped the charge, not in retreat, but in understanding that in an instant. She reached out, placing her palm against the warrior's chest, the same gesture that had triggered the initial malfunction in the entrance exam. The armor's adaptive systems flickered, struggling, recalculating. Ilara's hand remained firmly placed as the energy fields of the warrior's armor began to break down. The system was not prepared to process such a simple act of contact. In seconds, the alien's armor fractured, shattering under the weight of her unrelenting focus. The warrior dropped to its knees, its weapon falling to the ground with a metallic thud. The arena went silent. The remaining cadets and instructors stared in stunned disbelief. No one had seen this before. No one had ever imagined such an outcome. The alien warrior, designed for battle, had been outmaneuvered and broken by the simplest, most human of actions: contact, focus, and persistence. Alara stood alone in the center of the arena, her eyes scanning the now silent chamber. She had just done what no one, not even the governing intelligence, had thought possible. She had broken the system. The lights in the arena dimmed, signaling the end of the simulation. But Alara wasn't done yet. Her journey had only just begun. The Academy had underestimated her, but it wouldn't be the last time. And as the doors to the arena opened and Alara walked toward the awaiting evaluators, a new tension filled the air, one they had not prepared for. It was the tension of realization. Stay tuned to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling HFY sci-fi stories where humanity stands tall, breaks limits, and defies expectations. Alara stepped out of the arena, her every movement precise, unwavering, but underneath the calm exterior, her mind raced. The Academy, once an invincible bastion of knowledge and power, had begun to unravel its own foundations in the wake of her actions. She had been tested in ways the highest-ranking species had never imagined, and now the entire institution was struggling to adapt to her presence. What had once been a structure designed to shape and control the galaxy's future, leaders was now fighting to understand why she, a human, had shattered every expectation they held about their own supremacy. The corridors leading away from the arena were quieter than before, every step Alara took seeming to carry a weight that reverberated through the walls. The cadets, who had once watched her with curiosity or amusement, now seemed unsure. Some avoided her gaze, while others seemed to study her with something new: fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of something they could not comprehend. She wasn't supposed to be here, and yet, here she was walking through the halls of the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy, like she owned it. The academy had built its reputation on its ability to break species, to measure their worth and determine who would rise and who would fall. It had never been tested by a species like humanity. Alara's actions had proven that humanity's strength was not in brute force, not in raw aggression, but in something much deeper. It was in their ability to persist, to endure, to adapt. Where other species collapsed under pressure, humans found ways to adapt, to learn, to evolve. And the Academy had never accounted for that. As Alara made her way to the debriefing room, the air around her seemed to hum with the energy of 1,000 unspoken questions. The governing intelligence, which had once been an unquestionable authority, now seemed almost reluctant to interact with her. It had tried to measure her. It had tried to categorize her. And it had failed. There was no standard protocol for what she had done. There was no history to compare her actions to. She was an anomaly, a force that the Academy could not control. And the tension in the air was palpable. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The shift in power. The debriefing room was located at the heart of the Academy, a space reserved for the most important evaluations. It was a stark, sterile environment, with walls lined with monitors and holoscreens. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the Academy's processing systems. Alara entered and took her place at the center of the room, her posture still. Calm, still composed. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, the scrutiny of the Academy's highest evaluators, and the curiosity of every species in the room. This wasn't just another debriefing. It was the moment when the Academy would decide what to do with her. The governing intelligence, its voice now tinged with a subtle edge of uncertainty, addressed her. Cadet Alara Venn, your performance has exceeded all expectations. You have broken the Academy's entrance protocols, and in doing so, you have demonstrated a resilience that we have never encountered before. The species who have walked these halls before, you have never displayed such a capacity for persistence under duress. Tell us, human, what do you believe is the source of your strength? Ilara remained silent for a moment, her mind calculating the best way to respond. She knew what the Academy wanted to hear, but she also knew that answering it in their terms would mean playing by their rules, and that was a game she wasn't interested in. Instead, she chose to speak plainly, truthfully, and with the understanding that whatever came next, it wouldn't change the outcome. It's not about strength, she said, her voice steady and clear. It's about endurance. I don't collapse under pressure. I don't break when things get hard. That's the difference. And that's why you can't measure me the way you measure everyone else. The room fell into a deep, unsettling silence. The evaluators, who had spent their entire lives training to dominate, to measure, to quantify, found themselves faced with something they had never been taught to understand. Ilara's words hung in the air like a challenge one that they didn't know how to respond to. How could they argue with that? How could they refute the simple truths she had laid bare? The Academy had relied on metrics of performance, metrics of combat, metrics of intelligence, but they had never accounted for endurance. And humanity, in all its imperfections, had just shown them that endurance was its most dangerous weapon. One of the senior evaluators, a towering alien from the Krenner species, leaned forward. His massive frame filled the space, and his eyes bright, yellow and unnervingly fixed on Ilara. Endurance, you say? But can you sustain this endurance against true opposition? Can you survive when your persistence is no longer enough, when the forces arrayed against you are too great? We are not a race of infinite resources, human. We know our limits, and we have learned to survive them. But you are playing a game you cannot win. Ilara met his gaze without hesitation. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet certainty. We are playing the game you don't know how to win. And I'm not alone. The room grew colder. The Krenner's expression shifted, but it was not in anger. It was in recognition. Recognition that Ilara's words, simple as they were, held the weight of truth. And that truth, however inconvenient, was undeniable. The governing intelligence paused before responding, its tone more reflective than it had been before. You may have proven your point, Cadet Venn, but you have also raised an important question. Can humanity, with its unique ability to endure, stand against the forces of the galaxy? Can your species, despite your lack of technological supremacy, your apparent vulnerability, prove that you are worthy of inclusion in the galactic fold? Ilara stood a little taller, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She wasn't here to prove her worth. She wasn't here to play by their rules. She was here to show them something that no one in this academy had ever considered before. That humanity could be more than they expected, more than they could ever comprehend. I'm here to show you that we are, she said quietly. And if you don't believe it yet, you will. With that, the doors of the debriefing room opened, and Ilara Venn walked out, leaving the academy, to reconsider everything it had thought it knew about strength, about limits, and about the human species. The academy had been built on a foundation of certainty. But now, for the first time in its long history, that foundation had begun to crack. And the worst part? It was just the beginning. If you want to know how the Academy responds to this unprecedented challenge, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This journey is only just starting, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The hum of the Academy's corridors seemed louder now. The usual ambient noise, footsteps, voices, the soft clatter of advanced technology had quieted, replaced by a subtle tension that hung thick in the air. Ilara's presence had done something no one could have predicted, not just in the examination room or the combat arena, but throughout the entire institution. The power dynamic had shifted in a way no one had prepared for, And there was a quiet undercurrent of fear that now flowed through the Academy's most senior officials. The governing intelligence, once an unchallenged authority, was no longer certain of its calculations. The patterns that had defined it for centuries, systems built on predictability and control, had been appended by a single human who had shown them that endurance, not aggression, could define power. No one, not even the most elite species in the galaxy, had ever thought to test for it, let alone measure it. Now the Academy found itself caught between pride and panic, struggling to reconcile its belief in superiority with the reality of Alara's persistence. Alara had returned to her quarters after the debriefing. The small room she had been assigned was sparse, its walls lined with data screens that displayed information from her entrance tests, her combat simulation, and the adaptive models she had been subjected to. The room was designed to make a candidate feel insignificant, a temporary lodging before their real test began. But for Alara, it felt like a moment of respite. After everything she had endured, the tests, the simulations, the trials, it was a place where she could think dot and think she did. Her mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired. She had broken the system, but that wasn't the end of it. The Academy had underestimated humanity's resilience. They had thought they could measure everything with their technology, their advanced simulations, their perfectly calibrated tests. But they had missed the one thing that made humanity different: the refusal to break, the ability to adapt, to endure, to survive. But there was more to it than that. Alara knew that the Academy wouldn't simply let her pass through unchallenged. They would find a way to test her further. They would find a way to define her and humanity in terms they could control. And when they did, she would need to be ready. She sat at the desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The data before her was almost too much to process. It was an entire catalog of species profiles, strategic war games, and battle simulations. All of it designed to measure worth, strength, and survival. She scrolled through the data, eyes scanning the detailed reports. There were hundreds of species cataloged, each with its own unique abilities, technologies, and weaknesses. And then there was humanity, the species that had never truly been measured. Not by their strength, not by their technology, not by their power, but by their capacity to endure. But endurance alone would not be enough. The Academy would push her further. They would push humanity further. And they would do it with everything they had. Alara knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside her quarters, the hallways were still, but she could feel the tension building. It was as if the entire institution was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The Academy had always prided itself on its ability to shape the future of the galaxy, to determine who would rise and who would fall. But now, for the first time, the future was uncertain. The balance of power had shifted, and no one knew how to correct it. Days passed in a strange quiet. Alara continued her training, moving through the Academy's halls with an air of quiet defiance. She was aware of the eyes that followed her, the whispers that trailed in her wake. Some cadets looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, while others tried to engage with her, eager to learn from the human who had somehow broken the Academy's mold. But Alara knew what was coming. She knew that the true test wasn't over, and she was preparing herself for what came next. It came sooner than expected. The summons arrived at dawn. The message, transmitted directly to her quarters, was curt and direct. Report to the command deck for special evaluation. Immediate action required. Alara stood and looked at the screen. Her heart didn't race. Her pulse didn't quicken. There was no fear. There was only focus. The next challenge was here. She had been waiting for it, anticipating it, and now it had arrived. The Academy had reached its decision. It was no longer content with observing. It was time to push humanity and Alara to their limits. When Alara arrived at the command deck, she was met by a group of senior evaluators. Their faces impassive, their expressions unreadable. Among them was the Krenner, the massive alien who'd been the first to question her actions. His presence was commanding, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You have proven that you can endure," the Krenner said, his voice deep, reverberating through the chamber. "But endurance alone is not enough. You will face the most difficult trial the Academy has ever devised. You will be tested, not just for your physical and mental resilience, but for your strategic ingenuity. You will lead a simulated battle against the most advanced war fleets the galaxy has ever seen, and you will do it alone." The words hung in the air. Alara didn't react. She didn't flinch. "You will command your forces against overwhelming odds," the Krenner continued. "Failure is not an option. We will test your ability to think under pressure, to outmaneuver a superior enemy, and to survive against impossible odds. Do you understand?" Alara nodded. "I understand." A strange calm filled the room. It wasn't confidence or arrogance. It was something else, something that came from the realization that she had already passed every test they had thrown at her. She wasn't playing by their rules anymore. She wasn't following their protocols. She was defining the game. The Krenner stepped aside, allowing the doors to the simulation chamber to open. As Alara entered, she could feel the weight of the eyes upon her. The entire Academy was watching. Her every move, every decision would be scrutinized. This was the final test. The Academy would either accept her and humanity, or it would break her. But Alara didn't fear breaking. She had already broken the system once, and she was about to do it again. With a deep breath, she entered the simulation chamber, where the war fleets of the galaxy awaited her command. It was time to show them what humanity could do when pushed to the edge. And when the battle began, it would be nothing short of a revelation. As Alara stood at the command console, the simulation chamber began to come to life. The floor beneath her feet hummed with a low vibration, and the holographic display flickered to life. An entire galaxy stretched out before her eyes, the virtual battlefield unfolding in real time. Massive war fleets appeared on the horizon, their ships colossal and imposing, each one designed to evoke dread in any who faced them. These fleets weren't just advanced in terms of weaponry. They were built for overwhelming power, for decimating entire civilizations. The human race had never faced anything like this, at least not at this scale. And yet, Alara was calm. She wasn't intimidated by the size or the might of the enemy. To her, it was just another challenge, a test of strategy, of mind, not of brute strength. The evaluators and senior officials observed her from the observation decks, their eyes watching with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. They had seen simulations like this countless times before. They knew that only the most brilliant minds, the most gifted tacticians, could handle such a task, but none of those minds had ever been human. Alara was different. She wasn't like any of the species they had measured before. Her strength wasn't in her weapons or her fleet. It was in her mind, in her ability to adapt, to endure, and to outthink her enemies. She wasn't just playing the game, they were. The simulation began. Alara's first move was calculated, but not in the way her audience expected. Instead of charging headlong into the battle, as most commanders might, she paused, taking in the full scope of the situation. The enemy forces were formidable, but their strength lay in their numbers, their overwhelming firepower. What they didn't have was adaptability. What they didn't have was the capacity to change in response to the unexpected. Alara's fingers danced over the controls, issuing commands to her fleet. The holographic ships under her command moved swiftly. adjusting their formations, taking evasive actions, and preparing for the incoming assault. But unlike the enemy forces, her fleet was moving with purpose, each vessel anticipating the next step, each captain operating with the understanding that victory would not come from sheer force, but from the ability to outsmart their opponents. At every turn, the first wave of enemy ships closed in, their weapons ready to unleash hell upon Alara's forces. The evaluators watched, holding their breath, as the human fleet prepared to engage. The enemy ships fired first, their energy beams searing through the void, aiming to obliterate Alara's ships in a single, decisive blow. But Alara was already 3 steps ahead. With a calmness that stunned even the most seasoned warriors, she gave the command to her fleet. Evasive maneuvers, now. The fleet didn't just scatter or flee, it flowed, a coordinated, graceful dance of ships weaving in and out of the deadly beams of fire. The holographic display shifted, showing the enemy's attacks missing their targets again and again. Every shot, every barrage of energy from the enemy was countered by her fleet's agility. The human ships were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet they moved like shadows, darting between the colossal enemy warships with ease. The evaluators couldn't believe what they were seeing. The simulation had been designed with overwhelming force, expecting the human fleet to be wiped out in moments. Instead, Alara had turned it into a game of strategy and patience. She wasn't fighting for the kill. She was fighting for survival. Buying time, allowing her ships to wear down the enemy, one strike at a time. Alara watched as the enemy forces became more frustrated. Their ships, once coordinated, began to splinter. The command structure of the enemy fleet began to falter. Their leaders could not adapt as quickly as Alara's fleet could. The human ships, small in comparison, used the enemy's own size against them. Every move Alara made was a calculated risk, every order a gamble, but it paid off in ways no one had predicted. The moment came when Alara gave the order for her fleet to engage in full force. The ships under her command moved with a fluidity that defied logic. They came together, coordinating an attack on the largest enemy ship, the flagship of the fleet. This was the moment the evaluators had waited for, the final test of Alara's abilities. Would she push her fleet too far? Would the strategy that had worked so far fall apart under the pressure? Alara had no doubt. She knew this was the critical point, the moment where victory or defeat would be decided. Her ships closed in on the flagship, dodging fire and weaving through enemy lines. The evaluators watched as the flagship's weapons fired again and again, but Alara's fleet was unrelenting. They had learned the enemy's patterns, anticipated their movements, and just as the flagship fired a final barrage, Alara gave the command, engage. The human ships converged in a tight formation, all weapons trained on the flagship. The first wave of attacks hit, breaking through the enemy shields. Another wave, and the flagship's defenses began to crumble. The final blow landed as Alara's flagship launched a full barrage of missiles that ripped through the enemy ship's core, causing it to explode in a brilliant cascade of fire and debris. The simulation ended in an instant. The holographic ships vanished, and the room fell into a stunned silence. The evaluators exchanged glances, their minds racing to process what had just happened. Alara had done it. She had taken a fleet far superior in numbers and firepower and turned it into a victory. Through sheer tactical brilliance, the Krenner, who had been silently observing, stepped forward, his eyes no longer filled with skepticism. Instead, they held a deep respect, perhaps even awe. "You have shown us something," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "You have proven that it is not the strength of your fleet, but the strength of your mind that matters." This was not just a battle. It was a demonstration of humanity's greatest asset: adaptability, resilience, strategy. These are the qualities that will allow your species to survive and to thrive where others have failed. Alara did not speak immediately. She simply nodded, her expression calm, but inside she felt the weight of the moment settle in. She had proven herself. She had proven humanity's worth. But this was only the beginning. The Academy had been forced to accept her, but the galaxy was vast. And Alara knew that the true challenge wasn't about proving herself to the Academy. It was about showing the rest of the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. As she left the simulation chamber, the door sliding shut behind her, she knew one thing for certain. This war was far from over, and she would be the one leading humanity to victory. The corridors of the Academy felt different now. The weight of the silence was palpable. Before, it had been a place of controlled order, a well-oiled machine where every species had its place, and every system followed its established protocol. But after the battle simulation, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a matter of how well the candidates could fit into the mold of the Academy's expectations. It was about survival, and humanity had shown that it could adapt and excel in the face of overwhelming odds. As Alara walked through the halls, her footsteps echoed with an unsettling clarity, marking the passage of a species that was no longer willing to remain in the background. The cadets who once watched her with mere curiosity now observed her with a sense of wariness, respect, and perhaps for the first time fear. They had seen her break their expectations, and now they were forced to reconsider everything they had once believed about human potential. The Academy, the most prestigious institution in the galaxy, had tested her, and she had shattered its carefully constructed limits. Alara felt the weight of the eyes on her as she passed through the Academy's various sectors, her mind already racing through the implications of what she had just accomplished. She had proven herself in the simulation, but she knew this wasn't the final test. The Academy had only just begun to understand what humanity was capable of. Now, it was up to her to show them that humanity's strength didn't lie in its weapons or technology, but in its ability to adapt, to outthink, and to never stop pushing forward. Her thoughts were interrupted when she was summoned to the High Council's briefing room. As soon as the doors to the chamber opened, she was greeted by the sight of the Academy's highest-ranking officials. Among them was the Krenner, who had witnessed her test firsthand, and who now regarded her with a silent intensity that felt both disconcerting and intriguing. There was no need for words to convey the significance of this moment. Everyone in the room understood that Alara had just made history. The Academy had never encountered a human who could break its rules, and now they were faced with the reality that humanity might be a force unlike anything they had ever anticipated. Alara stood at attention as the Krenner addressed her, his massive form towering over the others in the room. "Cadet Alara Venn," he began, his voice deep and resonant. "Your actions in the simulation have proven one thing. You possess a unique quality. A quality that cannot be measured by our standard protocols, nor can it be replicated by any species we have encountered." He paused, his piercing eyes never leaving hers. "You did not defeat your opponents through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. You defeated them through adaptability, through an ability to learn, to pivot, to understand your adversaries and outthink them at every turn. That is a trait we did not expect from your species, and it is one that will make you a dangerous asset or a dangerous threat." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alara did not flinch. She had already anticipated this. The Academy had always been about power, about testing for the ability to control and dominate. But that was not humanity's strength. Her strength was the ability to endure, to change, and to survive. And that was something the Academy had not been prepared for. "I didn't come here to prove my strength," Alara said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I came here to show you that humanity's value lies in our ability to adapt. We don't need overwhelming force to survive. We need the ability to outthink, to endure, and to keep going when everyone else gives up." The Krenner's expression softened slightly, though his eyes still held the weight of years of experience and power. "And yet, adaptability alone may not be enough," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "What happens when your endurance is tested against forces that do not care about adaptability? When the enemy is not interested in negotiation or compromise, but in total destruction?" Elara did not hesitate. "Then we fight. We don't fight with brute force, but with intelligence. We outthink them. We outlast them, and we never give up." There was a long silence in the room as the weight of her words settled over the gathered officials. The Krenner considered her response, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair. "Perhaps," he said finally, "you may be right. But we have seen humanity's strength in the simulations. What happens when we push you beyond your limits? What happens when you are truly tested?" Elara met his gaze, unflinching. "Then you will see exactly what humanity is capable of." The Krenner's expression changed, a flicker of something almost like recognition passing through his eyes. "Very well," he said, his voice more serious than ever. "We will see if your claims are true. The next phase of your evaluation will be different. It will not be a simulation. It will be a real test, a challenge unlike any you have faced before. We will send you into the wilds of the galaxy, into a battle where you will face not just one species, but several. And you will have to lead your forces to victory against overwhelming odds. Your adaptability will be tested in ways you cannot yet comprehend." Ilara's heart did not race. She had been expecting this. The challenge was no longer about proving herself to the Academy. It was about showing the galaxy, and everyone watching, that humanity's strength was not defined by the size of its fleet or the power of its weapons. It was defined by its ability to adapt, to survive, and to never back down, no matter the measure of this odds. "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm, resolute. The Krenner nodded, his face unreadable. "Then prepare yourself, Cadet Venn. You will face your true tests soon enough." As the meeting ended, Elara left the briefing room, her mind already preparing for the challenge ahead. The Academy might have underestimated humanity, but now it was time to prove them wrong. And this time, there would be no simulations. Only the cold, harsh reality of a galaxy that had underestimated the human spirit. Elara had barely a moment to absorb the weight of her conversation with the Krenner before the doors to the briefing room closed behind her. The hum of the Academy's advanced systems filled the air as she walked, but her mind was a flurry of thoughts. She had just been handed her most difficult challenge yet, an all-out galactic wargame, one that would push her mind, her adaptability, and her ability to endure far beyond the tests she had faced so far. The mission was clear. She was to lead a human squadron into a multi-front battle against several alien species, each one stronger and more technologically advanced than the last. It was a test that no one had passed. The Academy's previous leaders had failed under similar circumstances. Some had perished. Some had gone mad, unable to reconcile the gap between their intellect and the brutal reality of war. But Elara was not like them. She had been trained for this moment her entire life, even if she had never known it. Her entire existence had been defined by pushing limits and surviving in situations where others would have folded. But now, she was not alone. Humanity was behind her, its spirit burning in every decision she made. There would be no more simulations. No more rules of engagement dictated by the Academy. This time, her forces would be real. Her leadership would mean life or death. As Elara made her way to the command center to begin her preparations, the eyes of the entire Academy followed her. The cadets, once mocking and dismissive of the human species, now watched her with a sense of awe and fear. They had all seen her perform the impossible before, but now they would see her lead a battle where there were no guarantees, where victory would not come easy. At the command center, the faces of the other officers were a mix of expectation and nervous energy. The war game had been set into motion, but it wasn't just about following orders or tactics. Ilara had to navigate the delicate web of politics, personalities, and egos that existed between species. Each species that she would face was not only different in terms of technology and military strategy, but in their very worldview. Their way of thinking, their cultural pride, and their thirst for dominance would all be woven into the conflict. The first set of orders was handed to her. It was a holographic map of the galaxy, its regions marked with red circles, target zones of high importance. Some were mining colonies, others were political strongholds, and some were just scattered outposts of lesser importance. All were strategically significant, all were critical. She had to decide where to strike, how to strike, and when. As Ilara studied the map, her mind immediately began to form plans. The Academy's usual approach would have been to take the most direct route to victory: strike hard, strike fast, and eliminate the biggest threats first. But that wasn't her approach. She wasn't playing by their rules anymore. She understood that this battle was as much about outthinking the enemy as it was about surviving the battlefield. Listen up. Ilara addressed the officers gathered in the command center. Her voice cut through the murmur of nervous chatter, and all eyes turned to her. We won't be taking the enemy head-on. We will hit them where they least expect it. We are going to weaken their forces before they can even engage us. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. The human tactic of weaken first, fight later, was unfamiliar to the alien species in the room. They had expected Ilara to follow the standard protocol, but Ilara knew better. The enemy would come at them with overwhelming numbers, and they would do so with precision. If they met that head-on, her forces would be wiped out within hours. She had to make the enemy doubt her. She had to make them question their own superiority. You're not thinking conventionally, one of the senior officers, a Xenar from the Southern Expanse, said skeptically. If you delay engagement, they will seize control of the region. You're letting them dictate the tempo of the war. Ilara met his eyes without flinching. They won't. I'm betting on their overconfidence. We will take the smaller, more vulnerable targets first. We'll create chaos in their ranks. Make them waste resources. We'll show them that we're unpredictable, that we're a threat they cannot anticipate. Then we'll take the advantage, hit their weak points when they're at their most vulnerable, when they least expect it. The officer hesitated, his skepticism still lingering, but there was something else in his eyes now: curiosity, maybe, even respect. The other officers around the room nodded in agreement, though they were still hesitant. They had been raised to follow the Academy's principles, not to take risks in this way. But something about Ilara's calm confidence was contagious. They could feel that she knew exactly what she was doing, even if they couldn't understand it yet. We start with the asteroid belt, Ilara continued. We'll send a small, elite squadron to take out the enemy's communications relay. If we sever their ability to coordinate, they'll be left scrambling. A few murmurs of agreement followed, but the room was still tense with uncertainty. The plan was unconventional, but Ilara was the one in charge. The officers knew that if they didn't follow her, they would fail. It wasn't just a matter of protocol anymore. It was a matter of survival. The squadron would deploy in 2 hours. Ilara spent the time before the mission preparing. She ran simulations, analyzing every potential outcome, recalculating her forces, positions, and adapting her plan as needed. Nothing could be left to chance. Every detail mattered. She wasn't just leading a battle. She was leading humanity into its first real test against the galaxy's most formidable powers. In the meantime, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision she had made. The reality of the mission was settling in. She was risking everything: her life, her future, and the future of humanity. But she didn't have time for doubts. She couldn't afford to waver. This was her moment, and she was going to make it count. The countdown began. 2 hours passed. Quickly, but Alara's mind stayed sharp. As the squadron prepared to deploy, she gathered the officers for a final briefing. Her voice was steady, unwavering. The odds are stacked against us. We will be outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we never stop. We never give up. And we use everything we've got to prove that humanity is a force to be reckoned with. Do not underestimate us. We've already shown the Academy that we don't. Play by their rules, and we will show the galaxy that humanity does not back down. The officers nodded, their faces hardening with resolve. For the first time, they looked at Alara not as a curiosity, but as a leader capable of bringing humanity to the brink of victory in a war that would decide their place in the galaxy. The doors to the command center slid open, and Alara led the way. The next few hours would define everything humanity had worked for. It was time to show the galaxy that humanity's greatest asset was its ability to endure and adapt, no matter the cost. And it would start now. The moment Alara stepped onto the command deck, a strange stillness settled over her. The hum of the ship's systems, the soft clattering of activity in the background, all felt distant. Her focus was sharpened, her mind now a finely honed weapon. Everything had led up to this. The calculated risk she'd taken in her plans, the uncertainty of leading an assault into enemy territory, and the very real consequences of failure. It wasn't just her life on the line. Now every officer aboard this ship, every soldier in her squadron, had placed their faith in her, trusting that her strategy, her resolve, would guide them through the worst. The asteroid belt loomed in. The distance, a jagged line of rocks floating in the void of space. Hidden within it, the enemy's communications relay was housed, a crucial node that controlled their fleet's movements. Without it, the enemy would be disoriented, disorganized. And that was the window Alara needed to strike, to weaken them before they could even realize what was happening. Alara took her seat at the central command interface, the soft light of the ship's console casting a cool glow on her face. Her officers stood in a semicircle around her, each one focused on their respective stations. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Kale, a quick-witted and calculating officer from the sci-fi species, gave her a quick nod. His eyes held a silent confidence, one that had grown since the start of this mission. He trusted her, and that trust was something that Alara was not about to squander. The countdown to deployment had begun. They had minimal time to execute the first phase of the plan, and the pressure was mounting with every passing second. She glanced at the readout. The small squadron she was leading would be splitting into 2 units. One would carry out the mission to disable the relay, while the other would distract and draw away the enemy's attention, ensuring that the mission had the chance to succeed. "Status report," Alara said, her voice low but firm. "All systems are functioning within optimal parameters." "Commander," Lieutenant Kale responded, his hands flying over his console. "First wave is prepped for launch in T-5 minutes." Alara nodded, taking a deep breath. The Academy might have doubted her ability to succeed in a multi-species conflict, but she had proven time and again that humanity wasn't simply a pawn to be discarded. It was time to show the galaxy that adaptability, determination, and resilience were qualities they could no longer ignore. "Hold steady," she commanded, her voice laced with quiet authority. "Once we're in range, don't hesitate. Engage the enemy without mercy." As the ship moved closer to the asteroid belt, a deep sense of anticipation filled the air. Everyone aboard knew what was at stake. For many, this was the first true battle of their careers. The room grew quieter as the countdown to engagement continued, each officer focused, each one steeling themselves for what was to come. Then, a sharp ping echoed across the deck. The holographic map of the battlefield flickered on the central screen, showing their position in the belt and the location of the enemy relay. The data was precise, the path clear. Now or never, Alara muttered to herself. Without missing a beat, she ordered the first wave to launch. The fighter ships under her command tore from the hangar bays like streaks of light cutting through the asteroid field at breakneck speeds. Every ship was armed to the teeth, ready to disable, disrupt, and destroy. The first group of ships veered toward the enemy relay, their engines igniting in controlled bursts as they closed in on their rear target. The second wave, designed to create chaos and confusion, flanked the enemy forces, weaving through the asteroid debris to disrupt the enemy's sensors and draw their attention. A flash of enemy fire lit up the darkness as Alara's forces made contact with the enemy's perimeter defense. Her squadron had been designed for speed and surprise, and it was paying off. The enemy was still recovering from their initial shock, scrambling to recalibrate their systems, unaware of the human ingenuity that had led to this precise strike. The relay was in sight, but the enemy response was swift. One of the larger alien warships, a beast of a vessel, broke through the asteroid field, its weapons trained on Alara's squadron. The first wave was exposed, their position compromised by the heavy return fire. The enemy's guns roared, sending blasts of energy through the blackness of space, and several ships under Alara's command were struck. Sparks flew in the simulation chamber as explosions rocked the hulls of the ships, leaving trails of debris behind them, but Alara was ready. "Focus on evading. Flank them from the sides," she barked. The command was swift and precise. The human ships immediately broke formation, scattering and splitting into smaller, more agile groups. Alara's tactic was simple yet effective. The larger warship relied on brute force, but Alara knew it lacked the agility to counter a fleet that wasn't playing by the rules of traditional combat. As the enemy ship fired again, Alara's fighters darted in and out of range, each maneuver making the enemy's weapon systems more erratic, more ineffective. The chaos created a vital opening for the first wave to strike. One ship, piloted by Captain Zeta, an experienced human officer, launched a powerful missile at the relay's vulnerable power core. The missile struck true, and a massive explosion lit up the sky. The enemy relay was down. Their communications were disabled, but the battle wasn't over. With their ability to communicate severed, the enemy fleet began to fall into disarray. Alara's second wave swooped in, using the opportunity to push forward, attacking the larger warships from multiple angles. The enemy ships were now disorganized, unable to regroup, and that was when Alara issued the order that would turn the tide of the battle. Full engagement. No retreat. Her ships converged on the enemy, using their superior agility and adaptability to outmaneuver the more powerful vessels. The warships fell one by one, their shields failing as Alara's squadron exploited every vulnerability. They were relentless, tactical, and above all, they never hesitated. Each decision Alara made was one step closer to victory, and with every passing moment, the enemy's chances of survival dwindled. The final blow came when Alara herself led the charge toward the flagship of the enemy fleet. Her ship, a sleek and fast vessel designed for precision strikes, pierced through the enemy's lines. The flagship's weapons fired in desperation, but it was no use. The human fleet was too precise, too adaptive. The flagship's massive engines exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its once imposing presence reduced to nothing more than floating debris. Alara stood at the helm of her ship, watching the destruction unfold. Her mind raced as the silence of victory filled the command deck. The first phase of the mission was complete. The relay had been destroyed, the enemy fleet decimated, and humanity had proven that they were a force to be reckoned with. The battle was over, But the war was far from won. There would be more challenges ahead, more enemies to face, and more questions to answer. But for now, Alara knew one thing for sure. Humanity had proven that it was no longer something the galaxy could ignore. And the Academy? They would have. To recalibrate everything they thought they knew about strength, about strategy, and about humanity's place in the galaxy. Alara stood tall in the midst of the quiet aftermath, her heart still racing, but her resolve as solid as ever. The fight was far from over, but the victory had been sweet.
The silence in the command deck was deafening. Alara stood there, her fingers still hovering over the console, her eyes locked on the now empty holographic map of the battlefield. The familiar hum of the ship's systems, which had once been background noise, now seemed like the loudest sound in the room. She let out a slow breath, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The battle had been intense, but it had been only a small fraction of the war to come. The enemy had been crushed, their fleet scattered and disoriented, but this was just one victory in a much larger war, a war that humanity had yet to fully enter. Alara knew that the galaxy was not going to just accept this victory. The higher-ups in the Academy would be watching, but so would other factions, other species, who would now see humanity as a legitimate power. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's reigning powers had to take notice of humanity, not just as a species of little importance, but as a force capable of striking fear into even the most advanced civilizations. But she couldn't think about that right now. There were still so many unknowns, and her job wasn't done. As much as she wanted to relax, to breathe and soak in the triumph, she couldn't afford to. There was a war to fight, and humanity had only just begun to prove its place in the galaxy. "Commander Venn, the aftermath of the battle is being processed." Lieutenant Kale spoke up, his voice steady but carrying the same weight of concern that Alara herself felt. He stood next to her, studying the data streams as they scrolled across the console in front of them. Alara's gaze shifted to the display, watching as the various systems analyzed the wreckage left behind by the battle. The enemy fleet, once so imposing, had been reduced to pieces of shattered metal drifting in the void. Their ships, their weapons, their advanced technology, all of it had been torn apart by humanity's ingenuity. The enemy had underestimated them, and they had paid the price. "What's the status of the remaining enemy forces?" Alara asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "They're regrouping," Kale replied, his tone cautious. "The remaining fleet has retreated into the nearby systems. They're coordinating with a few other factions we haven't encountered yet, most likely trying to form a coalition. They won't take this loss lying down." Alara nodded, her mind already working through the implications. The initial victory had been significant, but it was only the beginning of what would likely be a prolonged conflict. The galaxy wasn't about to roll over and accept humanity's sudden rise. They would fight back, and they would fight hard. The idea of an underdog species rising to challenge the powers that had ruled for millennia was unacceptable to many. Alara understood that better than anyone. "We need to be ready for their retaliation," Alara said, her voice firm and determined. "Re-establish communications with command. We're going to need reinforcements, more ships, more manpower, and we'll need to create alliances. Humanity can't do this alone." Kale looked at her for a moment before nodding. "Understood, Commander. I'll get to work on the communications right away." As Kale left to make the necessary arrangements, Alara stood by the command console, her mind moving through every possible outcome of the situation. The Academy's plans for humanity had always been centered around the idea of proving their worth, not only to the galaxy, but to the other species that governed it. Humanity had been allowed to participate, given limited resources and minimal respect. Now they had proven themselves, but with that proof came a new set of challenges. The galaxy had seen what they could do, and the stakes had just been raised. For Alara, the battle wasn't over yet. The enemy, regrouping and strengthening their forces, would be back soon. And this time, it wouldn't just be a battle of tactics, it would be a war that would test the very survival of humanity. The galaxy had underestimated them, and now humanity was standing at the precipice of something monumental. But Alara wasn't worried. She had seen what humanity could accomplish when it was pushed to the edge. The Academy called it endurance. They called it adaptability, but it was more than that. Humanity had something deeper, something that couldn't be calculated in simulations or predicted by algorithms. They had the will to fight, the drive to keep going when all seemed lost. And now it was time to show the galaxy that no matter how many times humanity was struck down, it would rise again. A soft chime from the console interrupted her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She glanced at the display, noting the incoming message. It was from Command. She pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life, revealing the face of Admiral Lyris, a seasoned officer from the Academy who had been monitoring the situation from afar. "Alara," the Admiral said, his voice steady but carrying a sense of urgency. "The situation has changed. The enemy forces are regrouping faster than anticipated. We need to act before they can reassemble their full strength. We have a window of opportunity, but it's closing fast." Alara's brow furrowed. She had expected this. The enemy wasn't going to wait for them to catch their breath. They would retaliate with everything they had. "What's your suggestion, Admiral?" Lyris's face hardened. "We need to strike while we have the advantage. Take the fight to them. Their key stronghold is located in the Zentar system. We believe their leadership is holed up there, and if we can eliminate them, the rest of their forces will collapse." It was a risky move. If the information was accurate, it could be the decisive blow that would end the conflict. But there was also a chance it could backfire, leaving humanity exposed and vulnerable to a counterattack. The risks were high, but so were the rewards. "We're already assembling a task force," Lyris continued. "We'll need your leadership on this one, Alara. It's time to finish this." Alara stood still, considering the Admiral's words. The fight had only just begun, but if they took down the enemy leadership, it could cripple the opposing forces and put humanity in a position to negotiate or dominate. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. "I'll lead the charge," Alara said, her voice resolute. "We'll hit them hard and fast. I'm not waiting for them to recover. Prepare the fleet, Admiral. We're going in." The line went silent for a moment before Lyris responded. "Understood, Commander. We'll have everything ready on your command." As Alara closed the communication, her gaze swept over the command deck. The weight of what was about to unfold settled upon her, but there was no fear in her heart, only resolve. Humanity had proven that it could outthink, outlast, and outfight the most formidable enemies in the galaxy. Now it was time to show the galaxy that humanity had only just begun to rise. "Prepare for the next phase," she said, her voice calm but full of purpose. "This war is far from over, but we're going to win it, together." The next phase had begun, and the galaxy was about to learn that humanity wasn't just a force to be reckoned with, it was a force that couldn't be stopped.
If you want to follow humanity's journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.